Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a fun conversation with the editor-in-chief of Curbed, Kelsey Keith. Before taking this job at Curbed, she wrote for Dwell and Architizer, but Kelsey's writing career began in the late 2000s after she had finished studying art and was thinking about studying architecture in graduate school when she found herself in the middle of the New York media world. And it was at that time that she really began cobbling together a freelance writing career. And in this episode, Kelsey and I talk about that early career and what the media landscape was like then. We talk about being Curbed's first editor-in-chief and her sort of editorial vision for the site. And we talk about their recently published story package, The United States of Texas and California, which at the time of this conversation was coming out in about a week, but is now out, and you should really spend some time with it. It's a really brilliant and smart package of stories. I'm a big fan of Curbed and what they've been doing lately, and it's been a great source of design writing over the last couple of years. So I was really excited to talk to Kelsey about how she thinks about it and where she sees the site going and kind of her plans for Curbed going forward. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter that has additional content and episode previews. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Kelsey Keith. In people who are writing about design or design-related subjects. What interest came first? Were you first interested in kind of design, architecture, the built world, or were you more interested in kind of writing, journalism, editing? How did that happen?
This is definitely spurred by my interest in design and architecture, more specifically art and architecture. When I was much younger, I, like a lot of people actually, was interested in the idea of being an architect without yet understanding the all-nighters and the inherent masochism in the field. No, I was just always interested in built environment, I think, and design in general. I actually studied art history in college.
Oh, okay.
And so I initially thought that I would go into the art world.
What were you thinking? Like, what was your interest at the time, or what kind of jobs were you thinking you'd have?
I thought I would probably work in a museum or gallery.
Okay.
And so I went to college at the College of Charleston in South Carolina.
Okay.
And there is a pretty vibrant art scene there. There's a fine arts museum where I worked, and I also worked in the education department there. When I was in college, I did a lot of things. I was an assistant to a painter who worked in the old masters tradition.
Oh, nice.
So I mixed goatskin glue.
Oh, that's fun.
Smells revolting, but she's a talent. I mean, it was really amazing to see that sort of thing at work. Took studio arts classes, worked with some other independent curators and curated some shows myself. Or assisted in them, rather. I wouldn't say full curation, but, this was sort of in the mix. Did a thesis project that was curating an exhibition. And so I did a lot of that in college. I would say, though, probably my most memorable course at the College of Charleston, I also did the sort of year abroad thing and went to Paris and studied more art history there, which was incredible. My most memorable professor in college was one of my architectural history professors. I took a lot of architectural history classes in school, which was also just something I was personally interested in. Even though I was studying art and thought I would go into it, I just always really liked architecture. And it was this professor named Robert Russell, and he was a sort of lecturer where he would go well over his allotted course time, but people were just glued to their seats, rapt with attention.
They would just stay.
Interesting. Yeah, it was great. And that's, where I, first read the Virginia McAllister book and shacks and shanties, like this whole vernacular study was like something that we spent a lot of time on. And anyway, that really resonated. And so after school, I also studied arts management, which is more like the nonprofit side of the art world. So I did that. So I think I just sort of had a vague inclination that I would go into like nonprofit arts something. But I was sort of quickly disillusioned from that track because the internships available at the time, I think people have since changed this idea of fellowship, but at the time they were typically in New York anyway, 1 year long, unpaid, full time.
Right.
And my parents were like, "Oh, that's so cute. How are you gonna like live?"
Yeah.
And of course they're very supportive, but they wanted me to be realistic about being able to make a living, which I appreciate. And so I actually, as my first job out of college, I worked in, of all things, a luxury PR firm.
Okay.
But it was operated by a woman who, she herself was a liberal arts graduate. She went to college with my mother at Mount Holyoke. And so basically she like only wanted to hire people who were good at writing, you know, had this sort of sensibility about the world, or like well studied or whatever. So I did that for about 1.5 years. And what was super, basically, like, I think any job, even if it's not the job that you want or have any inclination to continue doing, should be, like, I prefer to go into things with a curious mind. And the benefit of that job was that I learned so much about New York, specifically New York-centric media.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
In that job over 1.5 years. And I got to know a lot of editors and writers and people like that. And, you know, given that the vibe at this particular, like, small boutique firm was not super PR-y anyway, I feel like the people that I met there, I don't know, I just connected with them as people and really appreciated their work. And it was really interesting for me to just, like, learn how titles and mastheads worked and how people get stories and what they're looking for and stuff like that.
Was that something, were you did you know you were interested in that stuff, or had you done much writing before that, or like,
no,
was that all
wrote
new?
Papers.
Right.
I think I will say the thing about art history, and this is true knowing a lot of people now in New York who don't do art history stuff but who studied it, there is sort of an aptitude for, first of all, like, memorizing lots of small details and then making connections between those things in larger ways. Our history is very tied to social history, cultural history, political history. And so it doesn't exist in a vacuum, you know, it's very much of the era in which it was produced. And so I think, to me, that gave me a good grounding just for, I don't know, movements, styles, eras, that sort of thing.
And how did that all come together for you, of like your art history background, and then you're working in this firm and you're kind of meeting writers and editors? Did you realize that, you know, this long interest in architecture, this kind of history that you're studying could actually come together and be...
Not quite yet.
Okay.
No, I quit that job to apply to grad school because I was planning to go to grad school for architecture.
Oh, okay.
I decided that's what I was going to do.
To be an architect at this point?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
But right around the time that I was applying, the financial crash happened.
Okay. I had a feeling this is where that was going, yeah.
And I know, and there's no right or wrong way. I think a lot of people thought, well, the job market isn't great, so I should use this time to get an education. And I think that's very noble and works for a lot of people. I, however, am very pragmatic in my approach, and I thought, wow, the job market, even 5 years down the road for young architects, is going to be terrible. Right. And this is going to be really expensive, and I don't know if I'll be able to pay that money back. So I'm just going to wait. Like, I'll just wait and see. And that was good, because that's not ultimately the reason I never went to architecture school. Right. It's because I assessed and realized that I love architects and I love architecture, but I am probably not personally suited to be a practitioner.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
And it's good that you were able to know that about yourself at that age, at that moment, because that could have been...
Well, I wasn't. I mean, I didn't have that realization when I decided not to apply.
Decision. Okay.
It was more the market environment, shall we say.
Right.
And then it sort of, the realization came to me later, and it was just like a forcing mechanism, I guess, to not go. And in the end, I think that was like the better thing anyway. So at that point, I was working in a restaurant. I ended up making about $20,000 the next year. My parents were very concerned about me.
And you were in New York at this time too. Okay.
I was in New York. But I lived in a 6th floor walk up in the East Village with a bathtub and a kitchen.
Okay.
I did not have a Metro card. I walked to work. The restaurant was on West 10th Street, so I just walked across 10th to go to work. I ate one free family meal a day. And did free yoga because a friend of mine who was also very poor, was doing the front desk stuff in exchange for free classes. So that year my world was very small. But I, on the side, started writing.
Okay.
Because basically some of the people that I had met at the time when I was in the PR firm, I was still in touch with them, still friends with them, and they knew that I was interested in art and architecture and design and stuff, and so they started giving me freelance assignments.
Okay.
Just because they were looking for somebody in that topic.
Yeah.
And there were a few people that really were just give it a shot, which is amazing. One of those people was Pavia Rosati, who started Daily Candy.
Yeah.
One of them is Tim Yu. He was an editor at Cool Hunting at the time.
Okay.
So shout out to both of them. They just gave me freelance assignments early on, even without a ton of clips or whatever. I mean, this was also an era when the world, even the digital world, did seem a lot smaller.
Yeah. So this is late 2000s at this point.
Yeah. This is when would this have been? 2009.
Okay.
Yeah, 2009.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very different online vibe than it is now.
And it's this was the era of when Tumblr had just been starting out.
Mm-hmm.
And people that I knew and were regularly around, the founder of Tumblr was someone that we kind of knew, and it was the same thing with the Gawker, all the Gawker people, or whatever tech startups. It was small. Everybody knew each other, and so it was kind of right place, right time, I think, in some regards. But I started doing more design reporting, and I can't remember, at some point I got connected with the people at ID Magazine.
Okay.
Which then closed.
I remember when that closed.
I can't remember when it closed. Maybe.
I think it was 2009, 2010.
I think it was 2010 because I would have started writing for them. I can't remember exactly, 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
It was somewhere in there. And Jesse Ashlock was the editor at the time.
Okay.
But a lot of people that I know now were involved with ID previously.
Yeah.
Jill Singer, Monica Kimserov,
yeah.
Julie Lasky, all of them were ID people. And then there was this crew of freelance writers that I was also tight with because we all wrote for ID. So that would be Ian Vollner, Eva Hagberg, William Bostwick, Michael Silverberg, just this crew, Jim Gaddy, people who we were just all doing the grind at the same time. And ID was very much a locus for all of those people. And that's how I started meeting a lot of designers in New York.
Okay.
That's how I started meeting a lot of, not architects so much, but writers and designers and design people.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And is this feeling this question, I don't mean for this question to sound so simplistic, but did this feel like it could be a job now, or that this was a career, or when did...
Yeah, I think that a lot of the freelancing was scattershot, as freelancing can tend to be, especially when you're young and you do not know how to maintain a business for yourself. I was not good at it. But that was sort of when it felt like I was starting to get a crew, so to speak.
Right. I know what you mean.
So a good example of that is William and I were tapped by our friends who had started this thing called American Design Club.
Okay, yeah.
And we were tapped to basically write this like independent magazine that was supposed to be for American Design Club.
Mm-hmm.
Alex Lynn of Studio Lynn designed it.
Oh, yeah.
We published. This was so long ago, but we had this whole thing. We had like gifts to put online. We had like the magazine. Like I remember the RBW dudes already knew Glenn Ligon because he had started like collecting their lights really early on, and so like we interviewed him, like did a home feature for the magazine, like wrote all this stuff. I don't know if I still have a copy of that thing, but it was fun because at the time it was like all of our like young, starting to be designer friends were at the very beginning of their careers.
Yeah.
And then all of us as writers, like most of those people I mentioned had already been writing longer than I had. So I was sort of like the newbie on the scene, but like, you know, we were all sort of establishing ourselves. And yeah, it was, you could sort of, there was this energy that everybody was like really at the nascent points in their career. And like, so we were coming up together, and that was fun. And there was just a lot of energy. And that was sort of the time where the like quote unquote Brooklyn design was like really big.
Yeah.
Like Brooklyn as like a, I don't know, marketing campaign. So all of that's really funny. And of course, most of these folks like are fairly well established now, and like, which is amazing to see. I don't know if I could dig up that magazine. I don't know if we still have it.
It's always funny for me in these conversations of kind of realizing how much overlap there is between kind of all of these people starting out, you know, in that kind of like late 2000s, early 2010, when all of this was really starting to kind of start to take a shape, how much kind of crossover and intersection there was.
Yeah, and I think the real point there is that it's not even like, oh, this happened once and will never happen again. This happens over and over in time.
Yeah.
And I think you just really have to like be observant of the world around you, like hustle, look for opportunities, and just like be aware of what's around you, and like appreciate it and know that there is something there. And also part of that is natural. It's just like identifying people around you who are doing cool things and being excited and energized by that. And I think it sort of buoys the whole group.
Yeah. I mean, it
wasn't intentional at all, but it's just like that was how it happened.
Yeah, and I know what you mean, because that is right when I was finishing undergrad. And I remember like being very excited about it all, because I was like getting ready to graduate. I was going to like work as a designer. There was all this kind of energy. And then I graduated and started working, and I felt like it had all just kind of like started to fall apart. This is like Twitter starts taking off, kind of these like blogs were not updating as much as were, and I felt like I had like missed a really important moment. And I like you just said, I constantly am reminding myself that like this is this kind of cycle, and these things kind of come and go. I don't want to
So I mean, I would say, and this can sort of sag into the next thing, but what's interesting, I think, about my career is that I've always kept, and this is true to this day, I've always kept one foot in the design world and one foot in the media world.
Yeah.
And so I was, even then, I was kind of operating in both spheres. And so I think that my career is a product of that.
That's
the first, like when during this freelancing time, like ID was very influential to me from the design side of things and knowing people in that sphere. But at the same time, I had gotten this sort of permalance gig, I don't even know, it was like part-time or something, gig with this publication that was like big at the time called Flavor Wire.
Oh, that sounds familiar.
And I worked for this woman named Caroline Stanley, who is one of the more incredible people that I know, a great editor. She's from the South as well, and we just always had like we were always kind of kindred spirits. She was hired by Elizabeth Spires.
Okay.
So again, very small world, Gawker alum.
Yeah.
She was like a consultant for Flavor Pill to launch this thing called Flavor Wire, which is basically just like a cultural compendium, but with like a really smart, funny tone.
Yeah.
So Caroline also just totally took a chance on me. I don't know what she saw in me, but because I was very young, but also just hungry, I guess, and willing to do the work for probably not very much pay. Anyway, so I had some title there, and I was writing a lot about all sorts of different things, all culture, but with this focus on design and architecture, because she had nobody else to write about that. And there was this one, this is so retro now. There was this one post I did that went completely viral that got the attention of somebody who then hired me for my next job. And that post was, this is so, I can't even believe I'm telling you this.
I'm kind of nervous all of a
It
sudden.
was, well, so Lady Gaga was like, had just broken on the scene and was like
Okay.
wearing these totally like, you know,
Right.
avant-garde
Yeah,
stage
like the
outfits,
meat dress
meat
and
dresses, and just like weird shit that most people didn't see on like Pretty Little Pop Stars. And so I did something comparing her stage outfits to architecture and design, and it was like a David Chipperfield Stadium in Rome, and like Torbjörn's
Wow.
like Delft contemporary version of Delft's pottery. Like it was
Oh,
it was
man.
also sort of weird stuff.
Yeah.
But things that I saw visually, and like nobody had done this before, I guess. Anyway, it was just like, I think it sort of, obviously people were into Lady Gaga, there's a celebrity thing, but also maybe it like anchored it so people could sort of understand some of
This
the
is
references.
amazing.
Anyway, that I'm pretty sure that post alone is what, in fact, I know this is true, so he won't mind me saying this, but grabbed the attention of Mark Kushner when he was starting Architizer.
Okay.
And so he needed an editor. And I know like every other person who interviewed for that job because I knew them all because of our sort of like set. But he hired me to start this thing. And there, at the time, it was like Arc Daily and Dezeen were already around. But Arc Daily was basically just, I don't really remember what shape it was then. Probably much the same. In any case, the idea was to start a sort of culturally relevant,
right,
funny, voicey thing about architecture. And it had to be written or had to be managed by somebody who like loved architecture but wasn't like so self-serious that like everything was going to be dry and boring. Because Mark himself, if you know him, is like super gregarious and like sociable and like, you know, he's just really outgoing. Mm-hmm. And while I don't know, I'm certainly not as outgoing as Mark, I think, well, I hope, I don't know, write that way or think that people want to read that stuff. And so I was the founding editor there.
Okay, so you were editing. What does that mean to be the editor?
Editing and writing. I was hiring people as writers and staff members for Architizer because at the time we actually had a staff. I don't know what's really happening there now, but so I had hired people and I was running the site, writing, and then doing like we have lots of events and stuff. So we did like this whole thing at GSAP where we like got to travel to Tokyo and London and Berlin to like go to this conference that was like all about construction. I mean, there was definitely some academic aspects to it.
Yeah.
But great time to be working on the internet.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, again, like media is not the job for you if you want to get paid handsomely. Uh-huh. I like look back sometimes at my salaries and I'm like depressed by it. But that job had so many perks in that like I was getting to meet so many people, interview people, travel, you know, sort of like learn from these people who had started this thing. Mm-hmm. You know, it was a startup that had different aspects to the business. And we shared the office with Mark and Matthias's studio, Hawken. So, you know. Yeah. It was great. It was like a big learning experience. And basically, for that job, I sort of set some goals for myself. Like, I want to reach this size. I want to get to this sort of prominence. And then once I hit that and grow it, I'm okay to go on to the next thing. Okay. So that's what I did.
I'm going to jump ahead because I do want to talk about Curb's stuff, and I don't mean to like go through every stage of your career. And you had a time at Dwell between that also. I've talked to a bunch of Dwell people, so I think we can just jump to Curb if that's okay. Because
I would just say the only interesting thing to know there is that like I actually put in a stint as editor of Curb New York.
Right, I saw that.
After Architizer for a very brief period. It was 5 months. Okay. And the person who hired me, who started Curbed, he was very savvy about how media works, and he understood that like getting poached by Dwell was like something that was important to me personally and would be better suited to my talents. So he was very gracious about it and understood why I would take that job. I will say the thing about being in sort of a blogging atmosphere where at the time the quota was like literally 12 posts per person per day, which is insanity.
Yeah.
It's actually really good because it totally took the preciousness out of my writing. I didn't stress about writing anymore after that because it's just rote. You just have to throw it up there. You just have to do it. People are going to read it. The public is going to see it. You have to write it. It may not be perfect, but like from that, you don't stress about it too much. That was probably the big takeaway of that short time. It's good to get that experience. And so I don't know, kids these days like just don't have the quotas that they used to.
Well, I mean, it's interesting though, because then when you came back to Curbed basically as editor-in-chief and the first editor-in-chief.
Yeah.
And so I guess I have two questions that may or may not be related, but they kind of connect to what you were just talking about, is that I don't think of... I'll try to ask this in a clear way. One, hired as editor-in-chief and as the first editor-in-chief, what did that mean? And what were the site's ambitions to even need an editor-in-chief? And then two, which maybe is a sub-question but might not be, is I don't really even think of Curbed as a quote-unquote blog anymore. And that idea of blogging doesn't seem like that even fits. Right. And so I'm kind of interested in that transition and maybe like what that looked like, or...
Well, so you kind of arrived at the answer yourself, which is they hired me because they wanted somebody to transition Curbed from its past and then present as like a sort of loose federation of blogs to something that is an outlet with a point of view and a purpose and an overarching strategy for how to execute that new purpose. And it was interesting to me, and we don't have to talk about Dwell too much. Another place where I just learned an immense amount. I was given a ton of responsibility. Print, digital, and live programming, and just learned a lot. And like I wouldn't have been prepped to do this job without that one. However, I will say that working in any shelter magazine, after a while, definitely can feel like writing about design in a vacuum.
Yeah. And I talked to Allison Arieff recently, and she said something. She almost used the exact same phrase, or something very similar to that.
But we've probably even talked about it. Like the Dwell DNA is very strong.
I've noticed that.
Every person who has worked there, even when I wasn't there. So while I think that was like the best case scenario of that kind of magazine, at the point when I started working there, it was squarely in the shelter category.
Yeah.
Obviously, Carrie had launched it with a sort of different perspective, which I respect and admire, which is why I work with Carrie to this day. She's incredible.
Yeah, she's so great.
Anyway, so for me, the chance, what Curbed provided, which is unique, is the chance to do what I have always wanted to do in my career, which is to unpack the value of architecture and design in an accessible way so that the public feels like they have buy-in about why it's important. And so what's interesting about that sort of thesis of my career, I guess, is that it doesn't actually need to be media, but media is a really good platform by which to like sort of carry out that thesis. In any case, Curbed was such an amazing opportunity because it's so rare that somebody calls you up and is like, hey, like I haven't even been really involved in this thing that I created and founded, and I think it has the opportunity to do something entirely different. I bet you have an idea about what that could be. Tell me about it. What do you think? And then eventually, well, it sounds like you're the person who should do this. Do you want to work here?
Yeah.
So, and so like, again, back to this idea that a lot of other things sort of talk about design in a vacuum. What I saw from the outset that had never been, nobody had really identified about Curbed, which seemed like a missed opportunity to me, was the fact that like it is really the sort of thing that applies to people who give a shit about where they live, and this idea of home that exists at different scales. So it's like an individual residence, a street, a neighborhood, a city, and then larger and larger to these more like universal principles of architecture, urbanism, or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting.
And so the very format of Curbed, which is this network where it has all these city sites, at the time they did have a national site, but it was entirely different than what it is now. It just, to me, sort of crystallized, like the future possibility of Curbed, like crystallized in this very natural way, and I was so excited to come here and to do something with it.
You started answering my next question. This is kind of like, I guess, really like the big question of kind of even why I wanted to talk to you, because I do think that what makes Curbed interesting is, well, maybe I shouldn't even set it up this way. I'm kind of curious. Let me think the best way to ask this. I guess my question is about audience, and I'm really curious how much, do you know kind of who is reading the site, and how much of that, how do you find that balance between the people like you just talked about that are just kind of really interested in where they live and this kind of idea of living, kind of together with industry people?
Right. Well, so
that was a weird way to ask that question, but do you know what I'm trying to
sort of. Let me just back up a little bit, though.
Okay.
So the first thing that I did when I started here, because it had just never really gotten the attention, it had no goals set for it, and was sort of like left to like wither on the vine a little bit, was this this national site. It had previously been called Curb National.
Oh yeah.
And like it didn't have. It was sort of, I think, started as like an insidery media coverage thing, as opposed to something with a perspective of its own, which was different from the individual city sites. So like Curb New York had a very specific purview at the time on development news, neighborhood news, real estate stuff, and it had over the years, to be fair, like covered a lot of architecture, just like in sort of a different viewpoint, with a different viewpoint. So the city sites were kind of like, I knew that they would need more investment and more work eventually, but like they were kind of just like doing their thing, and so that was fine for the meantime. But I knew that I could do a lot with a centralized site, which is to like hire people who are really good reporters, hire people with really high taste level, to sort of elevate the content, start doing more features, just things that are generally interesting, ramp up the features program to be like a lot more zeitgeisty.
Right.
And, sort of start to compete with magazines who are covering these things, architecture and design, but in a way that's much more, again, culturally attuned and like interesting, entertaining, but also smart and beautiful and well photographed. And I was like, I know that we can do this. And that was quite easy. I hired some amazing people out of the gate, and obviously could not do any of this without them. The first person that I brought on, first two people, one was Asad Serket, who's my deputy editor now. He had been... He was
the podcast host, right?
He hosted our podcast. So Asad was referred to me by someone from his previous job at Architectural Digest.
Okay.
She was like, he's a real talent. He's very young, but he's promising you would love him. And sure enough, I did love him, and he is super talented. And I was like, you are the person to do this. So I had hired him as the editor of the sort of flagship, now flagship.com. And then Patrick Sisson, who had written for me as a freelancer at Dwell, was moving to New York, and he's an amazing reporter, and has a lot of experience in the field. So I brought him on, and then kept one other person from that site, and then just hired all new people.
Okay.
So the idea was basically to start really building out the centralized resources of Curb, so that eventually we could extend these centralized resources, such as a really smart engagement editor, or social team, a photo editor, so that we could expand those sort of experts in their various fields to help the city sites then level up. But we really had to like do something with the centralized part so that there would, so that there would be like a pole for the umbrella that then like goes over the whole thing. So that was the approach and the strategy, and that worked really well. So I would say that was like the first year. Then we relaunched with a new design and opened Curbed Austin. And then thereafter, we were able to start working and executing on the rest of the editorial strategy, which is this idea that like local and national actually feed into each other.
Right, yeah.
And one can't really exist without the other. And what I mean by that is our sites that are city focused, like Curbed LA. Curbed LA has a huge value to people who live in Los Angeles and read it for news about their city. So one thing that we did there was to start to expand the coverage area a bit. So at this point, because there are a lot of issues that affect people in the places that they live that are not straightforward real estate, but or that affect like the built environment, and more specifically the people who live in that built environment. And to me, it was always the natural route for Curb to take, because it's about people and the places that they live.
Yeah.
So we expanded the topic area, and then from that, there is that local value that's very inherent to Los Angeles residences. At the same time, there are a lot of people who are interested in LA who don't just live in LA.
Right.
So there's that sort of second ring of audience who would just sort of read about Los Angeles even though they don't live there. And then there's the third ring, which is our national audience, which cares about these greater issues, but they often need specificity in order to care about them. And
That's
so it's much more effective to tell the story, for example, of displacement in a recently gentrified neighborhood if you're talking about somewhere very specific in Atlanta versus, hand-wringing gentrification is bad. Oh, gentrification. That doesn't do anything for people. And in fact, I think it's almost dangerous because it's too generalized. Gentrification as a word is actually something that we're careful about using because typically it's sort of a catch-all for many different aspects of a changing city.
Right.
And so we do try to be really careful about just saying what we mean when we're covering things like that. And I think that because we have people in 14 cities around the U.S., we are able to tell the stories of what's actually happening on the ground in those places, and then therefore make connections between those places around issues.
Yeah.
And so, we have an editor in Curb Seattle who can talk to somebody in Austin and find out, oh, that's happening in Austin. There's this thing that in Seattle that's sort of similar. Like maybe I should write about that too.
Oh, okay.
So they're talking to each other. We're able to circulate important local stories to a much larger national audience. And then likewise, we're able to commit, sort of these flagship resources around features and things like that to specific places.
Yeah.
So going back to Curbed LA, this year we did both a desert guide, which was like a regional guide.
Oh, right. Yeah, I saw this.
Areas around Los Angeles. And then we also launched our beginner's guide series, which is basically like a moving to city guide.
Right.
So both of those went up on LA this year, and then this week we just launched our San Francisco Beginner's Guide. So everything you need to know if you're considering a move to San Francisco.
I'm curious if you think about, it's interesting to kind of think about the city specific versus the like national or the kind of central site, but then also like these guides versus kind of reporting. Do you think about stories different? Like, do you divide between this is journalism, this is criticism, like this is an opinion piece? Like, do you approach those differently, or how do those fit together, or are they all just kind of
I think we
similar?
see them all of those things, which we do publish, I think we see them all as providing a service to the reader in different ways. Criticism, you need somebody with experience and a really, really informed perspective, sometimes to make judgments on things, often in pursuit of making things better, ultimately. We don't really, we all see criticism as, existing because we love the things that we're talking about, and
Yeah.
we want them to be as good as possible.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're not, and they need to be called out. You know, likewise, a lot of our reporting recently has been sort of in this guise of like inequality in the architecture field and how that, you know, informs the things that are built that are ultimately meant to service the public. Like, that sort of reporting is certainly a service to the public in order to you know, to talk about it and highlight it as a real issue that needs to be fixed. I think even our more sort of beautiful, like shelter type coverage, like we do house calls, for example, which are home tours with people and their beautiful houses.
Oh, right.
But those are also in a way service, because we are really very careful to talk about the people and the places that they live, why they live there, what they did, who they are. Like, it's not just this sort of surface facade of people living in their homes. It's much realer, and it's also presenting a much wider, honestly, cross-section of homeowners than you would often see in shelter magazines. And that's important too.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I would say that pretty much everything we do is very service-oriented in one way or another. And another way of talking about that is just that we are really big on providing context. Like, even when covering a renovation on Curb, it's never going to be just like before and after, voila.
Right.
It's like a really process-oriented 8-part series, like following somebody as they like decide how to save on square footage of tile.
Yeah, and I guess probably the majority of your audience has a kind of base knowledge or a certain. I doubt many people are coming to a lot of these stories completely blind without any kind of context, which I guess kind of helps a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we do have a pretty engaged audience as well. Like, people tend to come back. They are really like loyalists, and and anybody who talks, I mean, I don't think they're just flattering me. I mean, I think people are genuinely like really, really engaged by it.
Yeah.
But part of that is understanding that like there's always some service you can provide to a reader, and whether it's just providing contextual detail or giving them a perspective on something they hadn't considered before, or giving them access to an expert who can talk ably about their topic, or even just giving them incredible photography that we commissioned for something. I mean, all of that is like in service to the reader, but in a way that's like smart, and we certainly have a tone, and like there are standards that we set up for ourselves that we hew to very closely.
I'm really curious, what are the subjects that you're really interested in right now, or, you know, either kind of personally kind of in this field, or you could even kind of talk about it at a Curbed level of what are the things you want the site covering more, or kind of what's next, or what are the kind of big issues and ideas you're thinking about?
Sure. So that's a good segue to tell you about this project that we are publishing on October 24th. This has been in the works for about a year, and it's something that I've had in mind that I've wanted to do for quite a while. It's called The United States of Texas and California, and it's essentially using these two states as national bellwethers for specific topics that affect people in the places that they live. And those topics that we've identified are economy, urban policy, transportation, and immigration. And we did a lot of digging and researching and assigning writers to help us figure out where we were going to talk about these. But the idea is that we have isolated 4 towns in California and 4 towns in Texas where these issues are very prevalent locally. So the story of immigration in California is about this place called El Cajon outside of San Diego. And it has mainly an Iraqi population.
Oh, okay.
So Iraqi immigrants who had come here starting, you know, after the Gulf War, basically. And at this point, like, it's sort of an interesting look at how, you know, a town of immigrants or refugees might eventually like assimilate into something that people wouldn't even necessarily know is like. Yeah. But at the same time, of course, it has a character that is like very, you know, obvious to anyone who's attuned to it. So that's an interesting one. And then, you know, the immigration story in Texas is actually an artist who's doing an art project along the border around Brownsville. So we had sent a reporter to Brownsville to get a sense of what the border is really, what those border towns are like as a place, not just this sort of amorphous idea of a border. So
that's a great idea.
So basically, like looking at this topic from two different perspectives, one in Texas and one in California, but because it's curbed, it's always based in a physical place and the people who live there.
Yeah. I love that.
So we're rolling that out, and I think like this is really the distillation of what we're about. Mm-hmm. People and places and the stuff that they care about. But with, around these topic matters that are really pretty pressing and urgent to mm-hmm. people right now, especially, leading up to a midterm, for example, things like that.
Yeah.
And Texas and California are just really interesting, obviously, because they both have extraordinarily significant GDPs themselves.
Yeah.
The leadership usually takes quite a different tack in those states, but it's sort of interesting to think about, for example, that Texas will probably build its high-speed rail before California does, which is like not something people would assume.
Yeah, no.
There's a lot of green energy happening in Texas, not because it's green, but because it is an opportunity for free market enterprise and people can make a lot of money off of it.
That's interesting.
But there we go. So, part of this is also to sort of break people's preconceived notions and hope that people in Texas read about California and people in California read about Texas and hope that people nationally are like, what's this about?
Yeah.
So, of course, with that project, that's also the opportunity to do something which is very important to me, which is to really art direct it and spend a lot of time thinking about photography and design and reading mm-hmm. experience mm-hmm. and having all of these things go along with it. So we have this sort of capsule newsletter with individual interviews around these topics. That's leading up to the publication of this package.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Really flexing our creative muscles around storytelling and art and place in a way that I don't think anybody else can do really.
That actually was something that I was really curious about with Curbed. I don't mean for this to get kind of too technical, but Curbed being a part of Vox Media, which I think, at least for kind of design and media people, has just as big or close reputation for your content management system and kind of how you can structure your stories. And I was really curious how the technical back end what you can do with that and how that influences the stories you tell mm-hmm. from structuring it to the page to art direction and art. Does that influence how you think about how to tell these stories? And you're even talking about sending a newsletter and the way you can kind of break this up. How do you think about how all of that can fit together, which I imagine is different than a blog or a magazine?
Right. Well, I would say the main approach for that is just having a really amazing photo director who's been with us now for almost 3 years. And then we recently hired a designer to help us with that as well. And we, as far as the back end, which is called Chorus, it is an incredibly intuitive publishing system that makes it very easy for people to put content onto the internet. And I have seen a lot of systems, we were on Movable Type until early 2016. So,
oh, wow.
I know from clunky, but it's great. It's very intuitive. It's very easy. That being said, it's not a miracle worker because it has to apply to as many people as possible. It is fairly straightforward in its capabilities, I think. That's why I say, having a designer, having a photo director, and people who want to push it, who want to push those capabilities, are really crucial to what we're able to do visually. On this project that's launching October 24th, we also worked with a very talented engineer from another team. Okay. He's the SB Nation lead engineer. And so he built this sort of dynamic layout for us that's not generally possible for people just publishing every day in Chorus. That being said, course really like levels up the display for pretty standard stories on the internet.
Yeah.
And it's also just incredibly easy and nice to use.
I mean, even though it's not something that you can do on every story, nor would you want to, does knowing that that's a possibility to do these more kind of elaborate illustrative pieces, do you think about that when you're kind of...
Yes and no. I mean, I am greedy. I want awards, and I realize that when it comes to digital, people want to see the bells and whistles. They want to see parallax. They want to see interesting swipe features, whatever. So that is certainly a consideration. But for the most part, and in order to make sure that our brand extends across every platform where Curved lives, we rely mostly on the visual assets that we commission ourselves.
Okay.
So making sure that we're working with amazing illustrators. Our photo director commissions, like, honestly, I mean, photographers who work for all of the top magazines. Like, we have a really, really great, I mean, similar to hiring great writers, right?
Yeah.
We make sure that we're working with really good people so that the visual assets that we deploy across Curved really do sort of speak for themselves. Now that we have a designer, we're also working on like branding a lot of our regular series, so that we have our sort of own backlog of like art and stuff that we can use. And that makes a big difference because just to have those little touches actually takes something that's a fairly standard layout and then really makes it ours.
Yeah.
But that's sort of self-initiated, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
This was so fun for me. I think you're right about kind of what Curved is, and I am a loyal reader, and I find myself on it often. And I really enjoyed talking to you about all of this. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Of course.
This episode was recorded on October 10th, 2018 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm.